You've just hired a new person, but you don't know if they're 100% going to be the best fit for not only the role, but also the business. You may have thought, okay, well, it's all good. I've put them on a trial period. But sometimes those trial periods go wrong. Well, actually, a lot of times they go wrong. And a lot of employers try to steer away from probationary periods because everyone keeps saying, oh, it's too hard to fire someone under a probation. Today, I'm going to get into all of the details that you need to know to not only set up your probationary periods correctly, but to also feel confident if you are looking at terminating. Hi everyone, welcome back to Lawlands. My name is Sanam and thank you so much for tuning in today. I am so excited for this episode. I know I say that about every episode, but probationary periods, it is something that we generally tend to put in our agreements, but we don't really talk about. One, because a lot of employers shy away from it. Two, because people are being told that you can't terminate someone easily under the probation. And three, because when push comes to shove, it's a bit too late and you haven't really done any processes. But don't worry, that's why you are here listening to this episode where we're going to talk about everything you need to know about probationary periods. But before we get into it, I just wanted to say if you are loving these episodes, then please follow the podcast and definitely subscribe to the newsletter. I put information out on LinkedIn, but if you're too tired to be reading it on LinkedIn, then subscribe to the Lawlands newsletter. The link is in the description and you will get timely insights straight to your inbox because life is so much easier that way. So the first thing you might be thinking is, all right, why do I actually need to use a probationary period? Similar to a trial period, it's all about testing the suitability, baby. So we're looking at making sure that the employee is the right fit for the role. They're able to do the tasks and duties that they said that they were going to do. They have that level of skill set and also a good fit for the business as a whole. Now, a lot of times the conversation stops there. But if there's any employees out there listening, then I would say that this is also your opportunity to test out the suitability of the workplace for you. So you might walk into a workplace and say, wow, this is amazing. I love this place. And then the rose-colored glasses come off. Am I right? We've all been there where we go into a role and the role looks great in the beginning, but as time progresses, and it doesn't take too long, hopefully, the rose-colored glasses slowly come off and then you see the doom and gloom. Oh gosh, that's very negative. But it can happen, and those are the workplaces that you shouldn't stay at and you should definitely leave. But we've all been there. So I say that it's a two-way street. It's the ability for not only the employer to check the suitability, but also the employee to see the suitability of the business, their values, their culture, the people, making sure that this is the right place for them. And if it's not, then at least you have that ability to leave. And we'll get into all the details around the probation period and the notice period, but you probably will have a shorter notice so you can actually pack up and move on a lot quicker. And you don't really have to drag all of that out. But if it's just not working out, then it's just not working out, right? That does happen. And I really want to give a no-frills episode. This one is really for you to be able to take charge of your workplace and do what you've got to do well within the confines of the law, within your right to be able to do that as a HR professional, as an employer, as a manager. So definitely, this is about making sure that you understand the law inside and out and what you can do with the law. Now, the first thing that we need to have a look at is the difference and the similarities between a trial period and a probationary period, because I get that all the time. I did a talk recently, and in the talk, the first thing that came up when I discussed the trial period was, why does this differ from the probationary period? It sounds almost identical. Well, my friends, the similarities between the probation and the trial, and the reason why it gets very confusing, and remember, these are the similarities, is that yes, it is detailed in the employment agreement with a very clear commencement date. It is also something that's agreed to by the employer and the employee. And it's for a fair and reasonable amount of time as well. That leads me to what the differences are. We know that the trial period can be a maximum of 90 days. That's at a maximum, it can be 30, it can be 60, but at a maximum, it is 90. The probationary period, on the other hand, doesn't actually have an exact time limit in the legislation. But what we know is it has to be fair and reasonable to test out the suitability of that employee. So don't be putting them on 12-month probation periods. Generally, we would say 3-6 months maximum. And keep in mind the language being used here. This is in months. For the trial period, you're talking about days. The next thing that's a difference between the probation and the trial period is also understanding that with the trial period, you can't actually raise a claim or a personal grievance for unjustified dismissal. So this is very, very different from the probationary period where you do have that path to actually raise that personal grievance claim. And if you've been terminated incorrectly or anything along those lines, you are able to raise that claim. Now, of course, with the trial period, we know that a lot of people do raise a claim because they believe that the trial period is invalid, but that's a whole other argument. In a perfect world, you wouldn't be able to raise a claim. You can quickly terminate and let the person know that, look, you're out. With the probation period, you can't just let the employee know that, hey, at the end of this period, you're just not looking so great in terms of your work ethic. You're not looking so great in terms of your performance. So we've really got to let you go. In the probation period, it's a lot different. You're there to actually sit down with the employee, try to discuss the concerns that you have related to performance with them, try to get them back on track, performance misconduct, any of those kinds of things. You just need to try to work with the employee to bring them back onto track. And if they're not, then that's when you're looking at terminating. So it's not something where at the end you just do a quick assessment and you're terminating. It has to be a fair assessment. And that's the wording that keeps coming up, a fair assessment. What a fair and reasonable employer would do in the circumstances. That kind of wording just continuously comes up, as we know. Now, those are the particular differences. And I will link the episode about trial periods, just a refresher, as well as the LinkedIn articles that I've done in the past. So you can definitely go ahead and take a look at those. Those are the key areas that are the differences and the similarities. So like I said, leniency or a lot more ability to walk away quickly from the situation when you're dealing with a trial period. Probationary, a little bit different. So what makes the probationary period a probationary period? What makes it actually valid, right? We know that there's these parameters that we've got to work with, but what kind of sets it out? That's where we go to the Employment Relations Act. And Section 67, that is what details exactly what a probationary period can be and what that needs to look like. So the probationary period, for it to be valid, that is essentially an agreement between the employer and the employee. So there has to be an agreement made, similar to the trial period, that the employee will serve a period of probation, and the probation period needs to be specified in writing in the employment agreement. And it doesn't matter how the clause was drafted or what it specifies, but it should not affect the application of the law relating to an unjustifiable dismissal claim. So you should not be barring the employee from raising a claim, and it doesn't matter how the wording is drafted. Generally, the clause will say something along the lines of you are initially employed on a probationary period for the first X amount of months following the commencement of your employment. And that is usually the wording that's used because of the way that the legislation sets it out. The way that they say it is that it is after the commencement of employment. Now, you may be thinking, okay, well, if the wording's that way, then when can we use a probation period? There are actually two situations where this can come up. The first one is if you have a brand new employee to the workplace, just like a trial period. The second one is if an existing employee is moving into another role. So let's say that they were a barista and now they are moving into a head chef role. I know, far-fetched, I understand it doesn't happen that way, but let's just say that it is happening. Then you can absolutely offer them brand new employment and put them on a probation period. Now, I have heard conflicting information about this, but the general consensus is that yes, if they move into a brand new role, that's very different from what they were doing. The terms, the conditions, the job description, everything is quite different. Then they would be moving on to a new agreement with a probation period in there as well. So those are the scenarios where it can come up. I've gone through everything that you need to know in terms of where the similarities and differences are with the trial period, as well as where you can use this, what the legislation says. But now let me talk about some general tips that I have before I get into terminating, which is what everybody always wants to discuss when it comes to the probation period. Am I right? But let's talk about general tips. These are the things that, in no specific order, they're all over the place, but these are my top tips in terms of probation periods. The first one is making sure, even though it is common sense, but you would be surprised how many times we see this, is making sure that the employment agreement clearly has a probation period. The endless cases when I was looking at employment authority determinations, it was just non-stop. There was so much out there in terms of cases where the employer had thought that they had relied on a probation clause, but the clause wasn't actually very clear or the clause was non-existent. It happens. But that doesn't mean that it should happen to you. So just keep in mind that it has to be a very clear clause. Also, the clause needs to state the length of the period that you're assessing them on as well, or the length that the probationary period will be. And it needs to be very clearly laid out that they will be on a 6-month probation starting from the date of the commencement of their employment, or making sure that you have some sort of indicator of when it starts and when it's going to finish. The probationary period, please remember that it needs to be paid. I know if you're listening to me and going, Sanam, that's a given. I know, but not for everyone. So please make sure it's paid. The next thing I would say, and like I said, this is in no particular order, is that if we need to put it into the agreement and it is a term that is very specific to an employee's, potential or future of employment, then it is really important that you follow good faith obligations. And good faith obligations means notifying the employee that they will be put on a probation. You may be thinking, how do I do that? Simple. Just a letter of offer with an indicator in there that they will be on a probation period. The next thing that can always throw a spanner in the works is providing the employee with training. If you are dealing with a situation where the employee is just not getting it, they are not bringing themselves up to speed, you need to look at all avenues that you can go down, which comes under this fair assessment, right? A fair assessment of what they can do. And a fair assessment would be providing them with some sort of assistance and help. It just means that you need to provide them with adequate support. So if you've got an employee that's going, I don't understand how to use this particular part of this software or this particular process that you've suggested, it's about making sure that someone has taught them how to do that. So they can't reasonably fall back on that as the reason. Now, that's one place that a lot of employers get hung up on. I would also say that, again, it is really critical that you follow your good faith obligation. So this is where you need to make sure that you are giving them that guidance, that support, and that you have done everything on your end to make this the most suitable candidate and the most suitable employee. One thing that hasn't come up too often, but I've seen it come up a couple of times here and there recently actually, is can you extend the probation period? It's a contentious one. I tell you why. Because technically you can, but we need to rely on the fair and reasonable employer test. And when you apply that test, I would say that in most cases, you actually can't extend, because what you really need to be able to show is that during the time period that you set out, so let's say you set out a 6-month probation period, during that period, you need to be able to show how you just weren't able to assess their suitability. Maybe in some scenarios, the employee could be taking a massive amount of leave. Maybe they're taking 2 months worth of leave. They've let you know beforehand that was part of the recruitment process. Then you could potentially extend, but then the question would be, why not have the probation period a little bit longer anyways? Because the next tip that I have is that a probation period can be any length of time. Like I mentioned before, it can be any length of time. Generally, we would say 3 to 6 months, because that is usually enough to assess the employee. 12 months is a lot. It's a lot. Give them a reasonable amount of time, something that's palatable, because they also can walk away from an employment agreement as well. If they're being presented with this offer and they know that they're going to be on a probation period, they could easily step away and say, no, thank you. All right, now we're getting into spicy territory. Terminating under probation. Do you feel it? Do you feel the heat? We're getting into terminating under probation. And as many of you know, you can absolutely terminate an employee under probation, but you will always hear lots of alarm bells ringing, the biggest red flags, somebody just waving it around, saying, oh, but be careful. It's really hard to terminate them. They could easily raise a personal grievance, and you don't want to be stuck with that. And you know what? I was one of those people. I was one of those people waving the flag around. And then I thought, why is it so difficult to terminate someone? And then in private practice, I realized very quickly when we weren't needing to give very conservative advisory advice and we were giving a lot more spicy advice, I realized that it is actually very easy to terminate someone on probation. You just need to tick all the boxes, cross all the T's, and dot all of the I's. So, an employee who is dismissed during a probationary period can still raise a grievance claim if the dismissal was substantively unjustified or if a fair and proper process was not followed. So that means that there wasn't a justified reason and also that the correct procedures weren't done. Now, I'll get into what that all means, but it's really important to know that at the end of the probation period, if you're not happy or satisfied with the employee's suitability for the job, then you need to meet basically these three criteria. The first one is that you need to show that you have assessed them fairly. So, a lot of times, what you can do is when the employee starts, look, you've pointed them to the fact that they are on probation. You have put that in the letter of offer. Why not build out your processes from day one, all around having one-to-ones with the employee, checking in with them, checking in with their performance, having these performance discussions regularly? Why not do it that way? Why wait till the last minute? And that's what this is all about. It's about making sure that you have assessed them fairly and given them the opportunity to improve with support. So keep that in mind. So that means that not only are you providing them with the foundation to say that, look, this is what's expected of you. How are you doing in this area? You're also going another step and saying, hey, you didn't do so well with this. Was there any particular reason why? Was there anything that you wanted to discuss about this? And is there any way that we can help you with improving? And that's where you could maybe provide them additional training and support. And like I said, you don't need some external trainer to come in for a whole day workshop or anything like that. It's all internal. And the second one that I would suggest as well is to explain why you consider they are not performing to the standard expected. So it's all about making sure that they understand why they aren't meeting those targets. And performance is one of those that has to be completely objective. So it's all about making sure that when you're speaking to these employees, they understand that it's nothing to do with them personally. It's nothing to do with the particular person that they are. It's about meeting those standards in the workplace, maybe those key performance indicators, all of those different things. And the last one is that you need to make sure at termination that you are explaining to them that you would like to end their employment. I know no one wants to have that conversation, but that's what's included. So these are the three-pronged requirements, I would say, where you really need to make sure that you've tied everything off, everything is brilliant. And I would actually add one more to that, and I would say making sure that your employment agreement clause is ironclad. Now, in terms of what the termination process looks like, it's a lot simpler than you think. Like I said, the conservative advice that I've always heard and I've given myself back in the day was that you need to do the same amounts of processes that you would do in any other scenario. So let's say that you were doing performance normally. In New Zealand, we never have a hard or fast rule around how many performance management processes or how many warnings you need before you terminate. Not like the 3 strikes and you're out kind of situation, which everyone loves to adopt for New Zealand, but I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. Instead, we know you would need about 2 or 3 performance management processes and warnings before you go ahead and look at terminating the employee on that 3rd or 4th round. But depending on the circumstances, it could be 6 warnings before termination. It could be 5 warnings before termination. It could be 10 warnings before termination. You just never know because it's scenario to scenario, very specific on the facts, the training. You see all of those different layers. But with the probationary period, I always was under the assumption back in the day that you do your processes and you do maybe 1 warning here, another warning there, and then a 3rd warning. And those would all need to be shortened. And they would maybe be 2 or 3 week assessments of the employee to get to that warning. And that's when you would look at terminating the employee, maybe if they were on a 6-month probation. The question is why? The question is, why is the advice so conservative? Why is it like that? It makes no sense at all, because while the probationary period doesn't just allow the employer to have this discretion to just terminate, it is all about acting fair and reasonable. But why can't you do that? So this is where I would say that there is a way to deviate from the conservative approach and still be able to do what you've got to do for the betterment of your business and the commerciality that you need to bring to your business. So the first thing is that if you want to have a justified dismissal, so we're talking about how to terminate, how to have a dismissal that's going to pass that threshold, according to the cases that we've seen, then the probationary period termination needs to meet certain steps. The first one is that you need to assess, like I said, the performance of the role. I know I keep hammering into this, but this is where a lot of times people try to bring in the trial period way of doing things, which is, hey, you're really not good here and we really want you out. So it's a bye situation. But it doesn't work that way. Instead, in this particular scenario, it's all about making sure that you point out all of the issues and any shortcomings that they have. You give them that kind of training and support that they need, and you give them an opportunity to improve. This is where it's very different. Your good faith obligations mean that you need to give them some sort of opportunity to improve. So the way that I would do this, if I wanted to really get the ball rolling, is to make sure that from day one, I'm constantly meeting with the employee, recording the one-to-one sessions that are happening between me and the employee, and writing down any of the areas that they may not be performing in, and speaking to the employee about that, getting their feedback and showing this constructive kind of relationship, and really laying out to the employee, look, these are performance concerns. And if the employee turns around and feels unsupported, you flick that support in there and you're good to go. The next thing I would say in terms of a step would be making sure that you've really assessed the employee and you've really understood that the employee's performance, maybe their conduct. I know I've hammered in a lot about performance. It's a lot easier to talk about that, but conduct absolutely can be something that you discuss. One of the things that I personally had come up before I moved into my in-house role was actually an employee that had been bringing their employer into disrepute. As a brand new employee, they were on a probationary period and had a history of going to the Employment Relations Authority and raising a claim about their previous employers. However, they were never successful in those claims. But this made the current employer fearful, and rightfully so. They clearly have an agenda when it comes to their employers. And in this case, they really were baiting, and I could see that they were trying to bait the employer into falling out of line when it came to following the process. But our main prerogative was to keep them on that process, to really make sure that they weren't doing anything where they were suspending unlawfully or doing anything outside of the probation meetings, and making sure that they clearly laid out to the employee that what they were doing was incorrect. And it was a conduct related issue where they were speaking about the product and the services in a negative manner when it came to brand new customers. So I guess it was kind of counterintuitive to what they were meant to be doing in their sales role. And I would say that conduct is something that you can absolutely use, but it is important to pinpoint that down. So if it is something where there's theft in the workplace or something along those lines, then it is really important that you've got all your ducks in a row and your evidence backed up when you're having these disciplinary meetings and you're discussing these things with the employee, just like with performance, right? When it comes to making sure that you have done a fair assessment, like I said, it's all about making sure that the employee is fully aware of any concerns that you have, whether that's to do with their performance or their conduct. Put it in writing. There is no issue with having evidence or something in writing telling the employee that these things are a concern, that this is not okay in the workplace, or that your performance has issues in these particular areas. It actually solidifies your case. And I know that one of the issues a lot of employers and managers and HR professionals have is, how much do I put in? How much is too much? But it's worthwhile to basically take the rule of thumb of, if your document was being picked up and read in court, would you want all of that read out in court? And would a third party understand what's going on? Would it also look like you're being disadvantageous to the employee? All of that would need to be looked at. So if you've had a look at all of that and you can see there that you're raising these concerns with this employee and you're putting that in writing to them, then essentially what's going to come next shouldn't be out of the blue. They should completely understand. So this is where I would start with raising something a little bit more formal. And if you wanted to kick off the process, then it would be about making sure that you put something to them in writing, giving them the opportunity to bring a support person or representative, and that they can go out and seek advice if they need to. And they need to come in for this meeting where you will need to basically lay out everything that you're concerned with and also allow the employee to provide their responses. And if you believe after hearing their responses that there isn't a justified reason, then that's when you would go ahead and issue the employee with a final written warning. And the written warning should be very clear that, look, these expectations were not met. If they're not met in the future, that the potential of a termination is on the table, and it'll be termination obviously with notice. And after you've given the employee this final written warning, then you assess the employee's performance again. And the employer would go through and you would repeat the same process, and then you would terminate the employee. However, there are a lot of spanners that can come up in these situations, right? There's a lot that can go wrong, and it's really important that you've done this very well, because something as simple as you didn't provide me training right at the time of termination can be an issue. So to recap, the way that it would work is that you would go ahead, you would be raising these concerns from day dot, you would be talking to the employee about all of the issues in the workplace. That would gradually move its way to a more formal process like a performance management process or a disciplinary process, depending on if it's conduct or performance. And then from there, you would end with your final warning. And then after that, you may be looking at terminating the employee. So you can see here that it's all about making sure that you have not only gone ahead and given them that feedback throughout, that you have a formal process. And then after that formal process, one last shot at trying to give them a go. This really shortens it down to 2 formal processes essentially. Whereas what I had been advising on in the past, and I'm sure many of you have dealt with this as well, is that you need to do at least 3 processes and then look at terminating the employee. So what my key takeaways from this are, is that you really need to follow those general tips that I gave you. It's really about making sure that you have got everything in the employment agreement, everything's been laid out to the employee beforehand, and they're fully aware that they're on probation. The employer, the manager, the HR team, they are from the beginning really keeping on top of the conversation and the discussions with the employee around their performance, setting expectations, letting it be known where they're underperforming or there's misconduct happening, and also making sure that management are fully aware that these conversations need to be continuing throughout the probation period, and also being fully aware at the same time that the employee, if they need support or if they are indicating for support, that you are providing that. And even if they're not, having that somewhere in writing just to suggest that you are willing to provide support, or if there's anything that the employee needs, will just make the case look a lot better. Now, I know what everyone's thinking. You are thinking, oh my goodness, this is a lot. And I don't think I want to go through this process. I might as well just forget about it. But it's not as difficult as it sounds. And once you get into the swing of things, it will feel very much like the trial period. It's just that this is a little bit longer in terms of touching base with the employee, making sure that they're on track, getting them back on track, providing them support, and then really fueling those formal processes. I know it seems onerous, but I promise you it's not. Once you get the processes in place and once you know how to do this from the beginning, then you will be good to go. So remember those general tips that I gave you. Remember that there are certain criteria that you need to meet in terms of making sure you've done a fair assessment. Never forget about that fair assessment. Anytime you feel a seed of doubt, a cloud of doubt, follow that gut feeling, because most likely there's been something that's gone wrong in the process. And these go wrong very quickly and very easily because all of these other things are required. I hope that this was quite useful for you. This is one of those ones that can be tricky. So if you're feeling really stuck, then please reach out to an employment lawyer in your area. I am sure that they will be more than happy to help. And you can absolutely find the HR consultant or someone if you're looking for lower fees, because we know how much lawyers can charge. Before I close off, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone that has been following the podcast. I see the follower numbers going up, and I can't wait to tell you all about it in the coming episodes. If you haven't followed yet, then give it a follow. What are you waiting for? All right, well, thank you so much, everyone. I hope that you are having a lovely day, night, evening, morning, whatever it may be. And guess what? I'll catch you in the next one, everyone.